I saw his name, but I thought he was using that.
Yep. Okay. Welcome to the joint meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Water and Power Commission. May we have a roll call for the City Council, please?
Councilmembers Draymond.
Here.
Friedman. Najarian.
Here.
Weaver. Mayor Quintero.
Here. For the
And we'll do Commissioners Chan.
Here.
Miller.
Present.
President Foley.
Here.
And before you today is the General Manager of Glendale Water and Power regarding presentation on the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta and its relationship to reliable water supply.
Mr. Steiger.
Thank you, Mayor Quintero, members of the Glendale City Council, Chairman Foley, and members of the GWP Commission. It's my pleasure today to introduce a presentation on the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. And our speaker today is Kurt Schmude, who is a civil engineer and manager specializing in water resources planning. For the past 21 years, he has worked for the California Department of Water Resources and is currently with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Since 1988, Mr. Schmude has led multiple programs and projects involving the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, including levee improvement programs, land subsidence research, risk analyses, dredged material reuse projects, water quality studies, and wetlands restoration projects. Since joining MET in last May, he has been analyzing seismic flood risk mitigation strategies and large-scale ecosystem enhancements. And with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Schmude.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. Do appreciate this opportunity. This is really a pleasure to be here and to share with you the experience I've had over the last 21 years learning about the Bay Delta system. It is a very important piece of geography in California. As you probably all know, Southern California gets a vast portion, 30-40% of its water supply from Northern California. That water comes through the state water project down 600 miles through an aqueduct that's delivered, can take water all the way from the Oregon border and deliver it down to San Diego. So it's an important piece of infrastructure and an important piece of California's geography. And over the next 45 minutes, I'd like to share with you some of the risks, some of the key issues associated with the Bay Delta system. But if there's a couple take-home messages that I'd like to leave you with, or hopefully leave you with at the end of 45 minutes, is that we've got an unsustainable system in California. This Bay Delta system is going to change. It's going to change dramatically, whether we do anything or not. So it would be better to be proactive than reactive. This system, as I'm going to show you, has changed dramatically over the last 150 years. I like to tell people when you go out on the Bay Delta system, it's highly unlikely you'll see anything as it was 150 years ago. It's radically changed, and it's rigid, and that's part of the problem we have today, is that this system has been frozen. It was a very dynamic system before the Delta was reclaimed, and now what we've got is a very rigid system. So with that, I'd like to get started, and we'll go to the first slide here. A little bit about California. There you go. A little bit about California hydrology. This state, on average, receives about 193 million acre-feet of precipitation. And put that in perspective, Shasta Reservoir is 4.5 million acre-feet. And so you can see there's a considerable amount of water that falls either in the frozen form or in the liquid form on this state. 71 million acre-feet runs off. 65% of that flows to the ocean. These are average annual numbers. The Great Central Valley here, shown in the center, drains about 40% of the total runoff, and all of that water drains out through the Bay Delta system here into the San Francisco Bay. Here's a space shuttle shot of California and the Central Valley, and I've colored in the Bay Delta, or the North and South Delta, or South Bay, and to show you reference where the Delta drains out into. In California, what I like to say is we have a spatial and temporal problem. Unlike other parts of the country, we have most of our rainfall falling in the wintertime, and it falls in the north part of the state. So you can get almost 100 inches of rain up here on the north coast, and yet we only have 4 inches of rainfall down in the south deserts. And yet most of the demand for that water is in the Bay region, Central Coast, South Coast, and Central Valley. So we have to store and move vast quantities of water in this state. So we can take a drop of water that lands up here at Oregon again, and we can move that all the way down to the southern end of the state. And the delta is at the hub of this water supply system. You can see the rivers and major aqueduct systems here, but the delta is at the center of this water supply transfer. What a lot of people don't realize is how important the Bay Delta is in terms of its water supply, not only for Southern California, but for the Bay Area region as well. The Bay Area region gets directly from the Delta 33% of their water supply, and when you include Hetch Hetchy and the McCallum River Aqueduct, they get about 75% of their water from the Central Valley watershed. We talk about the Central Valley receiving Delta water and how important the Central Valley is to this nation's produce and food production. The Central Valley produces about 45% of the fruits and vegetables in the United States, and some times of the year, spring and fall, about 100% of the lettuce in this nation. West Coast, there are 2 ports in the Bay Delta, the Port of Sacramento, Port of Stockton. About 25 million people get their water supply, some or all of it, from the Delta. It's an important part of the Pacific Flyway. It's an important part for the salmon fishery migration. It's also there's also a lot of recreation, both boating, windsurfing, fishing, and duck hunting and bass tournaments. It's a valuable ecosystem. There are 450 different plants and animals, 50 different fish, and 225 different bird species. But what's most interesting is that many of those species, if you were to weigh the biomass of the ecosystem in the Bay Delta system, over 90% of the biomass was not there. It's non-native. It was not there 100 and 150 years ago. So it's an invaded, very much an invaded ecosystem. The native species are clearly in the minority. A little bit about the geography of the Bay Delta. Sacramento is up here. This is the Sacramento Deepwater Ship Channel. Over to your left is the Suisun Marsh. That's 110,000 acres. Most of that, there's 30,000 acres of bays and sloughs, but there's about 50,000 acres of managed duck clubs in the Suisun Marsh. In the Delta proper, we have 1,100 miles of levees. 700 miles of those are private levees. 350 miles or so are what we call federal or project levees. And then there are 700 miles of waterways and some 57 islands or holes. I like to call them holes because you think of an island as something that sticks up out of the water. As I'll show you in a minute, these are in fact holes because they go below. So let's zoom in and take a closer look at the Bay Delta as we fly in from on high and take a closer look here at some of the key features of the estuary. The Delta in its current form doesn't look like anything like it did 150 years ago. This is a map of the Delta as it was discovered in the early 1800s. As you'll see on this map, there aren't many straight channels. I don't see any on there. And when you look at a map of the current Delta, you'll see many straight channels. And so let's take a quick fly-in. We've gone back and looked at a lot of historic maps of the Delta, and we've taken those maps and recreated what we think the Delta used to look like if you were flying over the Delta in a small plane. We're out over Stockton currently in a small plane, and we're going to fly out over the Suisun Marsh. Here we are out over the Suisun Marsh, and we're going to fly east back up into the Delta. So here we are just entering the western Delta as we think it used to look like 150, 200 years ago. Doesn't look anything like the Delta you would fly over today. A lot of these very, what we call dendritic braided channels with a lot of tidal marsh, and you see right where you see the trees along the channel, those are what we call riparian forest. So it was a vast wilderness. And on the left now, you'll see a timeline showing how the Delta, this tidal marsh, was reclaimed for farming starting in the 1870s, 1860s. So it was by decade here, you'll see how the islands were levied off, drained, and then farming commenced on these islands. So this is what we have today. So of those, all those areas there in the light yellow were historic tidal wetlands. And if you look at the delta today, all of those 95% plus are gone. So if you were in the delta 200 years ago, absent those stacks in the back, what you would have seen were vast acres as far as you could see. Someone once described to me, and I certainly would agree with it, it's almost primordial. You're out in the middle of it, and as far as you can see in every direction, you're surrounded by this. But there's very little of that left. This is a photograph that I've colored in from 100 years ago of what the central delta used to look like. These channels were very meandering, and each channel had a large reach of tidal marsh adjacent to the main channel. As you got into the fringes of the delta, certainly along the main river stems, you would have seen this kind of habitat. Again, there's very little of this left. This is what we call riparian forest, or shaded riverine aquatic habitat. And the transition between those riparian forest and the wetlands probably looks something like this. And here's in red showing mapping of all those historic channels that existed in the delta 200 years ago. And in the upper right is the configuration of the current delta channels. And you can see there's a vast difference between the channel system on the left in the red and the channel system on the right. And what that has done, if you're a fish, and you were a fish back 200 years ago, there was a tremendous diversity of habitat types. If you didn't like it where you were, you didn't have to swim far to get the right kind of temperature, nutrients, food supply. And that isn't true today if you're a fish in the delta. If you don't like it where you are, it's tough luck, because it's all pretty much the same. So along in the 1850s, when the Chinese laborers got done working up on the railroad, they moved into the delta and started building levees by hand, as shown here. And then by the late 1800s, clamshell dredges like this one were invented and constructed, and they came into the delta and started doing levee building in earnest. The thing is, though, that these levees were not engineered. They were simply, material was grabbed out of the channel and plopped on, and these levees were made kind of haphazard. And we're living with the consequences of that even today as we go forward with levee problems and levee cracking and levee failures. So today, unlike those pictures I've been showing you, this is what you see predominantly throughout the delta are farmlands. And one thing to note here is how dark the soils are. That's because these soils are highly organic, and that's what causes the subsidence problem. This is Bethel Island, so there is some urban encroachment. Many of these homes on Bethel Island are below sea level, so everything that's not on a levee is either up on stilts or it's below sea level. And that's Frank's Tract in the background, an island that was farmed and then in 1938 was flooded and never reclaimed and has remained an open lake like that. And doesn't, so once they're subsided, they don't revert back to tidal marsh. Some people would like to say, well, let's just go in and breach levees and restore tidal marsh. Well, once farming has occurred, you subside the islands, and once they're subsided, you can't breach them and expect tidal marsh to come back because the elevations are too low. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So agriculture in the delta. The heart of the delta is this region here, which I've designated in the middle there, and the predominant crops in the central part of the delta are corn, pasture, and alfalfa. As you get into the south delta, you get asparagus, now more and more blueberries. In the north delta, pears are more predominant, and you have wine grapes in the north delta as well. But in the central delta, it's these crops, and the delta, the whole delta region generates less than about $2 billion a year in total economic output. Yet the economic output from the water supply coming from the delta, state and federal water projects, is in excess of about $700 billion. So about half of our $1.5 trillion economy is being driven by water coming from the Bay Delta system. So pears in the North Delta And if you were flying over the Delta today, this is what you would likely see. Pictures like this, and this, and this. This happens to be Holland Tract on the upper left, and Old River meandering through some Channel Islands. How many know what that is?
Sturgeon?
It's a sturgeon. Is it native or non-native?
Not native.
They are a native species to the Bay Delta system. These fish can grow up to be 12 feet long, 100. I once asked the question what that was, and somebody said that's a girl, and I couldn't argue with them. So, but these are native. This happens to be a white sturgeon. Green sturgeon are a listed species. They are native species to the Bay Delta system. And that is salmon. They migrate through the Bay Delta into the upper watersheds to spawn, and then the salmon smolts migrate downstream through the Delta. How many know what that is? On the upper screen, that is a Delta smelt. Native, obviously. One of the things I like to say about the Delta smelt, it's probably the most powerful fish in the world, able to turn off large pumps. So, on the bottom is inland silverside, also about the same size, 2 inches, like a Delta smelt. But it was introduced into Clear Lake in the 1950s to control gnats. It got out of Clear Lake, got out in the Delta, and now it's taken over. These are much more abundant fish than the Delta smelt, and they compete for the same food supply as Delta smelt do. And these fish, native or non-native, how many know what those are? Striped bass on the left, largemouth bass on the right. Striped bass were introduced, they're non-native, introduced into the Bay Delta system in the 1870s, late 1870s. By 1900, they were harvesting more than 1 million pounds of stripers out of the Bay Delta system. So they're a very prolific fish. A single female fish weighing 15 pounds can generate 1 million eggs. So they are quite prolific in the system, and they like to eat salmon. So you cut one of these open, and you check the stomach contents, and you can find 10 salmon smolts in the stomach of one of these guys. Sandhill cranes. So let's talk a little bit about Delta hydrology. Most of the good quality water that comes into the Delta comes in from the north, about 80%. 15% poorer quality water, higher salinity. The salinity in Sacramento is about 100, electrical conductivity of about 100 micromolars. Coming in from the San Joaquin, it's about 5 times that. On the east side, a small amount of good quality water. But the thing to know about the Delta is that it's largely driven by the tides. What I like to tell people when you're out in the Delta, and if you happen to be fishing in the Delta, if you're fishing out here on Twitchell Island and you lose your cooler into the water, don't panic. You just wait 6 hours and your cooler comes back to you. So the water sloshes in and out of the Delta twice a day. You have 2 high tides and 2 low tides. On average, the Bay Delta system discharges, if you will, about 76% of what comes in goes out to the ocean. 6% is used in Delta for in-Delta agriculture, and 18% is exported to the Bay Area, Central Valley, and Southern California. These are average annual numbers. During drought, these percentages of exports go up, and during wet years, flood years, those percentages go down. So how does water, we call this the California Water Highway. How does water get to the California economy? This is the preferred route currently under the system that we've got. Poor quality water from the San Joaquin does come in and make a left turn and go to the export facilities, but that's the preferred way we like to get water to the California economy. So what are some of the key risks? I'm going to talk about the seismic risk, subsidence, sea level rise, the fish declines, urbanization. We've got areas that are being urbanized. Although the economy has significantly slowed this urbanization, this is a threat to the Bay Delta system, because once we grow homes, it's kind of hard to go back. Sea level rise. We've been told to plan for 55 inches of sea level rise in the Bay Delta system over the next century by 2100. So the current levee system in the Delta is only designed for 1 foot of freeboard above the 100-year flood. So when I say the Department of Water Resources has done estimates that it would take between $4 and $12 billion just to keep up with sea level rise and ongoing subsidence to maintain the current level of levee flood protection in the Delta. So let's take a closer look, flying in from the Pacific Ocean. Looking here from Pacific Ocean out over the San Francisco Bay with the Bay Delta system, or the Delta in the background, Sassoon Marsh. If our models are correct, if we have 3 feet of sea level rise, we can expect salinity to intrude 3 miles further inland if you do nothing else. If you tried to combat that, you would be releasing huge amounts of fresh water, try to push back the saltwater intrusion into the system. So even if you could raise levees, or wanted to spend $12 billion raising levees, you would not overcome this salinity intrusion. And each island that fails is going to make that salinity intrusion that much worse. So subsidence, what is it? What causes it? Subsidence is the lowering of the land surface elevations. On the upper panel, you see tidal marsh, a cross-section of a channel where the tidal marsh is at about sea level within the tidal range. Farming came in, as I showed you earlier, starting in the late 1870s. As farming dried out the lands, it caused these lands to compact, blow, burn. They used to, during World War II, they used to come in and have peat. They would burn the soils when they were growing a lot of potatoes out in the Delta. But today, most of the subsidence in the Delta is due to what we call microbial decomposition. Just like you take a pile of leaves and you set it out in your driveway, you rake it up, and that you leave it stand for a while, the pile gets smaller and smaller as it decomposes. The peat soils, because they're highly organic, are also decomposing, and they are giving off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Here on top, a cornfield in the Delta is releasing 50 pounds per acre per day, peak, these are maximum measured, but 50 pounds per acre per day of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've done calculations just to give some reference to that. If you were to stop, all the carbon flux coming off the Delta peat soils would be equivalent to taking every SUV in California and converting it to a Toyota Prius. The total carbon loss since the Delta was reclaimed in the 1870s is equivalent to about 5 years of the total U.S. production of CO2. There's that much carbon that is coming off the Delta. The Delta, because of Delta farming and subsidence, the farmers have oxidized about half of the peat soil that was created over the last 7,000 years. So today we have a Delta that is far below sea level, and that's really what generates a lot of the seismic risk and the levee risk, because if the levees were if the land surface elevations were at sea level, these levees would be very short, but because of the subsidence now, the levees are as much as 30 feet tall to hold back the tides, and they're holding back the water 365 days a year. So island flooding as a result of subsidence is a recurrent problem in the Delta. 162 levee breaches in the past century, and every one of those shown in blue has flooded since 1960. And the Public Policy Institute of California has estimated, based on their calculations, there's a 90% probability half the islands are going to flood in the next 50 years. And the Delta Risk Management Study done by Department of Water Resources estimates there's a 50% chance 20 islands will fail due to an earthquake by 2030. And I'll show you what the consequences of that would be in just a minute. But the high-risk zone are those areas where the greatest subsidence has occurred. So here's what a levee in the central Delta looks like during high water. This is a web track during a similar flood event. Now let's talk about earthquakes and seismic. These are the major fault systems in the Bay Area. There is one not shown here, we call the Midland Fault, that runs right underneath the delta. And it's these faults and combination of faults that is providing the seismic risk that the delta faces today. The seismologists have estimated that we're past due for a big earthquake. They're putting some fairly high probabilities of an earthquake, major earthquake, 62% probability of a 6.7 magnitude or greater hitting the Bay Area by 2032. And you can see from this tombstone plot that many of the earthquakes that hit the Bay Area culminated in the 1906 earthquake. And then we've had essentially releasing all the strain on the rubber band in the fault system. And the strain has been building and building and building. And so we're due, as that strain has built up, for another significant earthquake in the Bay Area region. And you can see the 6.9 occurred on the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. DWR has estimated $2.3 billion in levee repairs. And what I like to say is an easy way to remember the statistics here, the probabilities. There's a 30% chance of a $30 billion economic loss in this state by the year 2030. We could see, with a really big earthquake, economic damages going probably close to $100 billion. So let's take a look at what we think that earthquake would look like. This happens to be the hydrology on July 1st, 2002. An earthquake hits, a major earthquake, equivalent to the 1906 earthquake that hit San Francisco. Each one of these red dots is a levee that's liquefying. Remember, these levees are saturated year-round, so they're easily liquefiable. Here's a levee turning to jello, slumping. As they slump, there's about, under high tide, there's about 5 million acre-feet of accommodation space below sea level. So there's a tremendous void that needs to be filled. So as we pan back in the first minutes after the earthquake, you'll begin to see Twitchell Island, Bradford Island, Webb Tract, Bethel Island, Holland Tract. They're all beginning to fill up with water. We've calculated velocities in the channels on the order of 19 feet per second as the water's rushing in from the ocean to fill this void. And in just a minute, we're still in the first hours after the earthquake, and in just a minute, you'll begin to see the ocean bay water, salt water, now rush into the delta to fill the void created by this massive earthquake. So we're 17 hours after the earthquake. You can watch the timeline on the bottom, and the animation speeds up. We're now day 2, day 3 after the earthquake. Here's day 4. And down on the bottom, here is the intake for the state and federal water projects. So after 8 days, the state's water supply has been shut down, and it could be shut down for a significant period of time. One of the things that we did at Metropolitan was to look at what you could do in the short term to try to mitigate this impact, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So let's talk now about the biological opinions and the Fish and Wildlife Service Delta Smelt opinion. What the Fish and Wildlife Service did was to say, in essence, that you have to restrict the negative flows in Old Middle River down here in the bottom part of the delta. Historically, these channels used to flow north and out west. When the pumps are on and pulling, when the delta's in balance condition, we actually cause the net flow in Old Middle River to go south instead of north. And so what the Fish and Wildlife Service determined through looking at some statistics was that there was a correlation between these negative flows and the number of smelt that were taken. We've since done further analysis to show that what appears to be happening is the smelt are being drawn down into the South Delta when there's turbid waters being drawn into the South Delta. So we don't think it's always a necessary correlation between flows. We think it's a better correlation between turbidity, and that's one of the things we're working on for the near term. But these consequences are not small. In 2008, 670,000 acre-feet of water, by our calculations, was lost, equating to about $167 million. In 2009 through May, about 360,000 acre-feet. We estimate annually that the smelt biological opinion is costing between 20 and 33% annually. And you add on top of that the new salmon biological opinion, and you can add in another additional 10% cut on the water supply. A lot of the blame is placed on the water projects, when in fact there are many other impacts on the fishery. One of those is, as I've already shown, we've lost a tremendous amount of the habitat. I have biologists, friends of mine, that have told me they believe that we probably did a vast amount of the harm to the fishery due to the loss of the wetland. So we put the patient in intensive care, and then each little nick or cut has caused a species decline that was largely caused by the loss of habitat. So toxics are another issue. There's a strong look at the ammonia coming off the Sacramento Regional Wastewater Treatment Plant. The ammonia being released from that plant is thought to have an impact on the food source for Delta smelt, the phytoplankton, zooplankton. Exotic species, clams, corbicula, are non-native species that have moved in and are filtering a lot of the food supply for the native species. The state water project, like the federal water project, take their water currently out of the South Delta. The state water project, as it was currently authorized, as was authorized in 1960 and is still authorized, included a peripheral canal. The intakes in the South Delta shown here in the upper left were only intended to be there for a short period of time while the canal was going to be constructed. We've been living with this structure since the 1960s, and the consequences of that are significant. If you're a fish and you get into the South Delta and you get drawn down Old and Middle River, you have to be screened here at these screening facilities, and you're put in over here into these buildings. You're loaded into one of these yellow or one of these white buckets, and then you put it in a truck, and then you're trucked 20 miles back to the western part of the Delta and dumped down a pipe where you've got waiting stripers and black bass ready for lunch. And there's over 7 million fish in 2003 that took this truck ride. So we're looking at, as I said, a better system that reduces conflict between fish and water supply. And one of the things that we're looking at are putting some gates in the central Delta on Old River and Connection Slough with the idea of managing turbidity so that our biologists and scientists feel that there's a good correlation between smelt movement and turbidity. And if we can control turbidity movement into the South Delta, we can limit the number of smelt moving in front of the export facilities. And the freshwater pathway is something we'd build, and I'll show you that in a second. This, after the big earthquake, one of the things that we could do in a reactive manner would be to isolate Middle River by closing off all the neighboring channels, closing the breaches, and then pumping the salt water out of that channel, and then resuming limited export facilities through what we call this isolated pathway. We estimated that this would be probably 6 months to get in place after the earthquake. Tidal marsh restoration is a big part of the legislation and a big part of what the Governor's Blue Ribbon Task Force called for. One of the, I think, more brilliant things that the Governor's Task Force did was to establish co-equal goals, that the ecosystem and the water supply are co-equal, the highest priority co-equal beneficiaries in the Bay Delta system. And in order to restore the ecosystem, we need to restore tidal marsh. And because of subsidence, it's difficult. So what I've shown here are areas in green and yellow that are currently in the intertidal range, that are currently at the right elevation, we could restore them to tidal marsh. Areas that are purple, we need to do some land surface accretion in order to get them to an elevation where they could be restored to tidal marsh. This happens to be in an area in the North Delta. I'll show you here. It's up here, right? That picture was taken right there off of Little Holland Tract in the lower Yolo bypass. And it was an area that was flooded about 10 years ago, and it's been amazing to see how naturally restored these tidal wetlands have become. This area actually is a good area for delta smelt now. So this is one of the areas where we're finding the highest concentrations of delta smelt is up here in areas that have restored naturally. So the Public Policy Institute has put together a map of what they think the future delta, sustainable delta, will look like. Because of subsidence, they've basically indicated that the central part of the delta is not worth saving and that it will likely end up as open water habitat in the future. Sustainable ecosystem habitat in green, habitat-friendly agriculture in purple. So the future for the Bay Delta system really relies on these co-equal goals, and in order to achieve water supply reliability, we need to separate the water supply from the ecosystem. In order to do that, we need to isolate through either a canal or a tunnel, taking the water on the Sacramento River, moving it around the delta down to the export facilities, and then we'll allow the estuary, the ecosystem, to do what ecosystems like to do. That is, have high residence time, easy migration, lots of tidal marsh, and this system will function much better when we're not taking water directly out of the center of the delta. A little bit of history. The Proposition 9 that was put before the voters, which was the peripheral canal back in 1982, was a very polarizing vote in this state. It's hard to imagine any proposition in California receiving 90% of the vote, but as you can see, Northern California voted overwhelmingly against the canal back in 1982. The canal and the proposition back then was a vastly different proposition than the one we've got today through the legislation. It's a much more comprehensive program, including ecosystem, recreation, a lot of delta as a place. So it's a much more balanced, comprehensive program. But in the meantime, until we get a long-term solution, we're really stuck with, Band-Aids, 2 gates, patching together systems for the short term. So, in summary, I guess what I'd like to do is, again, reiterate the delta in its current form is not sustainable. We've got subsidence problems, salinity intrusion, sea level rise. We've got seismic earthquake risks in the delta. Carbon fish conflicts, urbanization, non-native species, and loss of habitat. So, yeah, again, if there was one take-home message, it's that we can't continue to keep doing what we're doing. And if we do, the delta is going to vastly change at some point in the future, whether we do anything or not. So with that, I will wrap it up and ask if there are any questions.
Questions or comments?
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking you, Mr. Schmuti, for an excellent and comprehensive presentation.
Thank you.
I'd like to make some of it a little bit more relevant to residents of the city of Glendale. You stated that, I believe, up to $700 billion of the state's gross product per year is susceptible to damage from a seismic event on the delta. Is that correct?
Yes. The state and federal water projects, which take water out of the delta, generate on the order of, I think it's between $500 and $700 billion.
And you also mentioned that if a seismic event were to rupture many of the levees along in the system, that it would be out for quite a long period of time. Is that long period of time days or months or years? If you were to try to go in and patch up all the levee system in order to restore the water supply, you'd be looking at years. Okay.
Years. And
so So years of damage translates into something more like over $1 trillion of damage to the state economy, agricultural and municipal.
Yes, that's where the Delta Risk Management Study had looked at what the probability of certain damage amounts, economic impacts, and that's where they came up with, a $30 billion impact by the year 2030, a 30% chance. So, but yes, it could go much higher. It could happen today. It could happen 2 weeks. It could happen, 10 years or 20 years from now. But that risk is building. So.
But that's the risk I think that the people of California are challenged to manage somehow.
Right.
And how much of metropolitan supply comes from the State Water Project on average?
I think about 30%. Yes.
30%. And how much of Glendale's comes from the Metropolitan Water District?
I don't know.
About 65%.
About 65%. So we're looking at maybe 20% or so being possibly impacted on average by the State Water Project. That's a fairly large amount. Recently, the state legislature and the governor took some action with respect to some of these risks, seismic risks, and let's say reliability and quality problems that you outlined. Could you tell us a little bit about what those actions are?
Is it okay if I bring Dee up here?
Yeah. This is Dee Zink, who's Manager of Legislative Services for Metropolitan Water.
Thank you.
Hi, pleasure to be here and meet all of you. I just want a clarification on the question. You had asked about recent activity. You mean the most recent activity on legislation or previous investments in flood protection vis-a-vis some of the initiatives that passed earlier? I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Well, specifically, I was asking about the recent Senate bills that were passed. So, but if you feel that some of the older actions are relevant, please feel free to add those in.
Okay. If I could just draw your attention, there's a handout that each of you received, and I just wanted to point to a couple of things in the handout. This is produced by the Department of Water Resources, and it's a good synopsis of what happened with the legislative package. There were 4 bills that were part of a comprehensive water package that were passed by the legislature in the special session a week ago on Wednesday morning early. And those bills make up a real critical element of our state policy on how to address water supply reliability for the state as well as ecosystem restoration. They are bookends, if you will, to the Delta visioning process that helps to make sure that that process moves forward. Metropolitan's been very keenly interested in this and worked very aggressively in support of this package because of what we are working on the regulatory arena to address conveyance in particular. We have 2 different tracks that we're working on. One is to try to move forward in the regulatory arena, something called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. This is the regulatory process in which we're addressing the habitat needs of the state and in which we are also looking at opportunities for alternative conveyance. It's a permitting process. But if we're moving in a regulatory track in that area, there's also a policy track that was necessary. And some of the challenges we've had in the decades up until this point in actually moving forward with the statewide water agenda has been a lack of accountability in the process, a lack of an overall encompassing plan for the Delta region that acknowledged water supply, a lack of an entity that's responsible for the wholesale restoration of this very important estuary in the state. And so what the legislation did in the form of 4 different bills, SB 7-1 is the first bill that's highlighted in your package, is to establish these important governance mechanisms. In this governance bill, what is set up is, first and foremost, the Delta Stewardship Council. This is a governing body that has as its sole responsibility the drafting of a plan for the Delta, and as part of that plan, the 2 goals that they're responsible for implementing are, again, this co-equal goals of ecosystem restoration and water supply reliability. So their job is to draft the plan that will be based on this Bay Delta Conservation Plan that we're working on in this separate regulatory track, but a plan that's larger than that, that addresses all of the needs in the Delta region, and through that process to ensure that we are implementing plans and projects and strategies that will help us achieve those local goals for reliability of our water supply and the ecosystem. There are other governance structures that are approved as part of this package. One is the establishment of a Delta Conservancy for the state. And right now what we have is we have a number of projects that we're working on through individual efforts to try to address some of the species challenges. But there isn't a comprehensive approach, and we're not going to be able to resolve the overall ecosystem challenges unless there is somebody that is looking out for the whole estuary and moving forward instead of in a piecemeal approach, but in a holistic approach that's really looking at the long-term health of this region. So that's another part of the governance. The Delta Plan itself, built on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, is important tool for us to make sure that we are making progress and that there's accountability in that system. And then there's also additional focus for a group that's in existence right now called the Delta Protection Commission that has, in its current role, looking out for the primary Delta zone and mostly focuses on land use issues of interest to the Delta region. And so one of the challenges that it's been with accountability in the past is that we have over 200 different agencies operating in the Delta. And they don't, frankly, all agree and have a statewide perspective on what happens with the water supply. So we needed to have an overarching stewardship council that would look at what is needed for the state for the water supply as well as the ecosystem and try to streamline those decisions and actions that often, unfortunately, conflict with each other. That's the main portion of the comprehensive package. There are a couple of other bills that are part of water management efforts for the state. SB Senate Bill 6, related to groundwater monitoring, really is an attempt by the state to do what is done and has been done for many years in Southern California, which is to get an accurate assessment of the groundwater levels in our basins, something that most of the Southern California basins that are both managed and adjudicated in many cases have been doing for years, but are frankly not done in the rest of the state. And so as we've seen drought impacts and less ability to draw water through diverted supplies, we've seen a greater reliance on groundwater resources. We don't have a good assessment of what that means to the state. So this would just simply require the reporting of that information to the state. The Senate Bill number 7 is an attempt by the state to begin to address the governor's call for a 20% reduction in water use per capita by the year 2020. We have not had a roadmap in order to try to meet that objective, and this lays out 4 different plans to do that. And in addition to that, it addresses agricultural water use efficiency, which obviously can't meet a per capita goal, but has many best management practices that they can employ in order to help reach that goal. And the last policy bill that's in the package, Senate Bill 8, deals specifically with water diversion. We've had a challenge for a number of years. You just heard Kurt talk about the impacts on the pumps and the knowledge that the pumps have impacted the fish species. But what we don't have a good handle on are the other 1,800 to 2,000 diverters in the Delta that are not monitoring their diversions and in some cases maybe illegally diverting water. Obviously, those facilities are having an impact on the Delta ecosystem. They are not generally screened like the large pumps are in terms of protecting fish from being pulled into the facilities themselves. And so this bill would say that we need to get a better accountability in the Delta, treat the in-Delta interest and diversions the way we do the rest of the state, and they would have to report that information so that we would have that. The last piece of the package is on page 7 of your handout. Probably the most informative piece regarding the $11.14 billion bond measure that is scheduled for the November 10 ballot is just simply look at the pie chart that's there. I would call your attention to the robin egg blue color that identifies $2.25 billion for Delta sustainability. This is the beginning of the ecosystem restoration project that is necessary in the Delta. It is integrally linked to the conveyance and the water supply reliability that we need in Southern California. And particularly as we've talked about possibly operating a new conveyance facility in a dual manner where we would either move water around or possibly move water through the Delta depending on fish conditions, we need to make sure that these Endangered Species Act issues are resolved. And so we find that to be one of the more critical elements of the package in order to secure reliable water for Southern California. Having said that, if you look at the other 75% of that pie, this water bond represents a tremendous amount of funding for projects that are urgently needed in the state right now, in the sense that we have a long lead time in order for us to be able to move forward with water supply reliability in terms of alternative conveyance. And until we have that in place, we continue to be basically in jeopardy of our water supply being restricted. So this funding is to try to help get additional projects funded and approved, and to allow for us to have interim measures that will begin to address some of the ecosystem challenges that are restricting pumping right now. And that's, I don't know that that answers your question. It's probably more than you wanted, but I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
It's a comprehensive answer. Allow me to elaborate a little bit more on this water bond. The state body, electorate body, is going to vote on this in November of, or when do they vote on this?
Yes, November of 2010, it will be on the ballot.
2010, so over a year from now. And that's bond, general obligation bonds for a little over $11 billion. And what does it do to address the seismic risk with the levees in particular? There
is funding for levees, and actually, in addition to this package, there's funding as part of an urgency measure in one of the earlier bills, Senate Bill 8, regarding water diversion and use. The bottom of page 6, you'll see that there's a call out for funding to be moved from Proposition 1E and 84 funds. 1E was the bond measure that was passed in 2006 to allow for voters to begin work on this extensive levee improvement program that is necessary to try to improve those levees that are critical to either urban population or water supply, et cetera. That priority that Kurt mentioned earlier in the DREAM study.
What percent of at-risk levees would be addressed by these two measures that you mentioned?
I'm sorry, I can't tell you that specifically. And most of the project funding within the bond itself is less. It's more directed towards actual water projects and towards watershed and ecosystem restoration than levee stability, because there is other program funding for levee stability projects. This is more designed to address overall water supply, and the long-term effort to address water supply reliability is in fact to either move the water outside of the Delta region, which remains vulnerable to all of the issues that were just addressed, or potentially to tunnel under the Delta region, so that we would begin to remove that risk from our water supply.
And the tunnel, to what extent is that covered by the bond?
Neither the tunnel nor conveyance are part of this bond package. The various alternatives for water supply conveyance are addressed through the Bay Delta Conservation Planning process. That process, which is again a habitat conservation plan at its heart, is basically a permitting regime to allow for infrastructure that's within the Delta to be constructed and operated in a manner that protects these species. So as we're moving forward with the environmental process for this habitat conservation plan, there are 4 different alternative conveyance facilities under consideration and to be reviewed as part of the EIR process. A west side alignment, an east side alignment, a tunnel under the Delta, or to operate it in its status quo position. And that is where we're focusing our efforts to address conveyance. And specifically not in the bond for 2 reasons. One is that the state water contractors and Central Valley project contractors have long said that they would pay for the construction of alternative conveyance for for that supply of reliability. So the most likely mechanism for funding those facilities would be through a revenue bond paid back by the beneficiaries of the system. It's based on the beneficiaries' pay principle, which we've upheld for a long time, number of years.
I'd like to let others speak. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to remind the commission and the council that we do have a time restriction. So,
Well, this is certainly comprehensive and very interesting. Thank you for the presentation. It was great. But I must admit, I'm quite surprised because I thought that an actual conveyance, as you call it, I thought that was part of the bond. I mean, whether it would be a pipe or canal or whatever it is. So that's somewhat surprising to hear, quite frankly. Were you also surprised?
Well, I wasn't surprised because I've heard about this, Mr. Mayor, but it's an interesting concept that as a state, what the direction we're going on is let's get the governance, let's get the projects and the money to fix the delta first, and then let's assess our options, and then we'll figure out what the best solution for water conveyance is, and then we'll fund it separately. This will no doubt be the subject of great discussion in the months to come. As an $11 billion bond is put on a ballot, there's going to be a lot of discussion. And I think as a city, we owe it to our residents to keep them aware of the fact that this is the necessary first step, but there is another step behind that, which will require further commitment from everyone in Southern California, but also Northern and Central California as well.
Director Kavunas, could I add one, or maybe I should ask the mayor, could I add one comment?
Sure.
I think it's important to note that the Department of Water Resources and the administration have already established that we have the ability to construct the facility, that we have the authority to do so, and it doesn't require an act of the legislature in order for us to do that. And that is why we are working in this regulatory tract through this Bay Delta Conservation Planning process. There was discussion about whether to include the peripheral canal itself into the policy package. And it is, in fact, in the policy package, but it's in the form of building the larger Delta plan around the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, where it's moving in a regulatory tract. To call it out more specifically than that, potentially drew additional opposition to the package, and it also, the idea that it would be included in a bond measure, such as you're discussing, was a concern to many folks who believe that we had already identified the funding strategy for that package, but also that it might draw additional opposition. And if the bond were to be voted down by the public, whether it would be because of the economy or any other elements in the package, having the facility, conveyance facility in that bond might be considered by some to be a referendum on the conveyance facility at all. And so rather than risk that, knowing that we had a clear path that we were moving forward, that is part of the justification or the reasoning behind pursuing it through the regulatory process and working to find funding for those other elements that are really essential to make sure that the conveyance is adequately addressed given the linkage of the
And in terms
two
of
co-equal
the
goals.
cost, I assume that would be agricultural interest, MWD, the end users of the water heading south.
And the Bay Area as well. The entire Bay Area down through the Central Valley, all of those project contractors would be contributing towards that facility.
Any other comments or questions?
I have one question. First of all, thank you very much for the very informative presentation and the information you're giving us. The discharge from the Delta, 18%, Kurt indicated earlier, that goes to the Bay Area, Central Valley, and California. With these bills, will that percentage change?
No, the bills are not intended to increase the water supply itself in terms of the amount of water. They're designed to increase the reliability of receiving that supply. The fact that we're right now have a 30% reduction in our water supply and potentially another 10% because of salmon impacts, what we're trying to do is restore that reliability or have that reliability that we frankly don't have right now. The bond measure does address additional water resources for the region. But the policy package itself is more about securing reliability.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Did you want?
Another comment? Go ahead.
Ask for permission here. Yeah, just to follow on that too, the legislation does specify that the State Water Resources Control Board set flow standards for a new facility. And one of the things that is apparent to us is that those flow standards are going to be based on what the habitat's going to look like. So we think the more habitat that you have, the more flexibility you will have in the system in terms of what those flow standards will look like. So we think it's to our advantage to help restore the delta as we begin to set these flow standards. And I was telling Dee on the way over here, we probably need to be looking at an adaptive management program, because it's not the kind of thing where it's going to be static. From you can pick a number a year from now or 2 years from now. That number is going to change as the delta changes. Sea level is going to rise, islands are going to flood, and more habitat is going to be created. And how the fish respond to all these external pressures or changes in the system is going to be something we're going to have to be very adaptive to. So.
Okay, thanks.
But in the immediate future, we still have to be concerned with the flow rates. I mean, they're not going to get any better for us. It's only going to get worse. Isn't that fairly accurate?
Well, as I tried to indicate there, we are trying some short-term, like the two gates. Our hope is through operating some short-term, understanding how these delta smelt behave. If we can get a better understanding on when they migrate, where they spawn, what kind of habitat they like, and then begin to change operations to favor that kind of habitat, we're hopeful that the Fish and Wildlife Service will credit us with keeping the fish out of harm's way, so that we can increase, if at a time when we can show that this works, that we can increase exports, water deliveries, at the same time we're providing more protection for fish. So those are the kinds of things we're doing in the short term. But in the long term, once we've moved the intake away from the estuary, then the smelt can do whatever, they can go wherever, spawn wherever, and find the habitat, and we're not impacting their food supply, we're not impacting their spawning or their critical habitat.
Thank you.
Any other comments, Mr. Steiger? No. Okay, well, thank you very much. Very informative. I assume we'll run this with the normal Channel 6 programming next couple of weeks. Okay, I need a motion to adjourn. Mr. Drain?
Second.
Motion to adjourn the commission meeting?
Second.
We are adjourned.